Hey, what's up? It's Phoenix, and I'm really excited because I'm going to talk about my trilogy of poetry, which I published over the course of a year, and I'm very excited to be able to talk about it. So without further ado, let's dive right in. Now, you may have seen the cover to all of my books, and I'm definitely excited to have these covers. So the first volume, which is called 1, features this cover, which is basically me, kind of a self-portrait, as you can tell. And then I also have 2, which, as you can tell, features an egg, which is broken, as well as 3, which features an egg seen, but a little bit further out of a shot. Now, I'm very excited about these books, the photos of which were taken by my good friends Preston and Tabor, as well as the covers for 2 and 3, which were designed by my friend Alex. And I'm very excited that I was able to make my trilogy of poetry. At first, I had planned on publishing it in 1 volume, but after working with it and realizing that it might actually work better because it was so long in 3 different volumes, I decided that I would go ahead and make 1, 2, and 3. And so that is what I have done. Now, you might be wondering about the symbolism that I chose to use, and I want to leave a lot of it to interpretation. I want to leave it open to your own thoughts, but I really like the narrative arc that the covers show because it really is an experiment into perspective. This poetry book is, and in narrative, and in poetry. And so I was very excited to be able to use these covers and to be able to express things in my poetry books that feature things that are related to my own curiosities and determination as an author and as a writer and poet, as well as covering a kind of narrative of change and of using the egg as a metaphor for vulnerability, fragility, and the like. And so I would say that I'm very excited that I've been able to publish these books. So, I mean, you can tell that it is certainly dense by looking at all 3 volumes, and that there is a lot of poetry in this book. And originally, when I had conceived the book, I didn't really know how long it was going to be, just that I wanted it to be very in-depth because the subject matter essentially was myself as an artist and poet, and I definitely wanted to capture the intensity of my own reflections and autobiography and ideas and thoughts and poems and words. And so I wanted to express something that was going to go all out in that way. Now, you might be wondering what the poetry involves, and I definitely encourage you to check out the books to be able to see them for yourself and to be able to read the poems for yourself. But I certainly wanted to convey my own curiosity as an artist. I wanted to convey the things that are important to me as an individual, and I wanted to write about my own personal experience and using poetry in that way. Now, oftentimes, poetry that uses the autobiography as source material is often seen as sentimental or passé or predictable. And I definitely understand this critique, but I actually don't think that it's true for certain types of poetry. For instance, I'm very conscious of language in my trilogy, and I do that intentionally because of the form of poetry. I wouldn't say that all of my poems are necessarily experimental, because they don't need to be, but I wanted them to be very expressive, and I wanted the language to reflect some of what I'm trying to do with my writing. Because to me, it makes the writing that much better, to be able to use language in thoughtful and creative ways to capture an experience. And I really liked that. You may remember from watching my channel that in the past, I've talked about my style of poetry, which I've described as being autobiographical, personal, experimental, and the word that I use that I would describe as being my own term is radical poetry. And I would describe my trilogy as having radical poems because not only are the poems radical in terms of the subject matter in which I try to convey, they're also radical in terms of the actual approach that I use with language. And again, they may not all be experimental, but they certainly are individual to my own experience, and I wanted to use my language the language that I use, my poetic language, in very thoughtful and original ways. And so I'm definitely glad that I was able to do that. Now, I don't think that the poems are immediately predictable, even though I'm writing about my experience, and that is because I often use my own techniques whenever I'm writing my poetry, which I think is another way in which my poems are become very original. And the language is definitely very creative with what I'm doing, because I am trying to convey deeper things than just my experience. And you might be wondering some of the subject matter in which I discuss in the poems, and you might be wondering why it's radical in terms of the content. And I would say it's because I write about unconventional things. I write about a lot of different things, such as my experience with mental illness and the ways in which my mind has changed and my life has changed as a consequence of mental illness, and as a consequence of my specific subjective perspective, and the way in which I grapple with intense emotions. It also deals a lot with sexuality, because in this book I was determined to understand myself and to understand what I really feel about my own identity and what it was that I wanted to say. And the third thing that I would say is I just love poetry. And so I have very much been inspired to utilize my own techniques throughout time, which would include experimentation with language, as we've seen, but it would also include rhythm and rhyme, as well as techniques from spoken word, for example, as well as perhaps even rap, which has influenced me in terms of thinking about the form. So it's definitely gotten me to think about language in a different way, as well as just using my own style of expression, of creativity, of assonance and consonance and dissonance, and being able to convey those things. And so I'm very happy that I'm able to do that with these books. Now, I would say that the books that involve this trilogy are not necessarily easy to read per se, because they are very dense and they deal with a lot of the things that I'm very, very interested in writing about. And I do think that my poems are probably a little bit hard to digest, partially because they are very personal and they often include they include a lot of emotions and a lot of intense feelings. And I definitely want to convey that richness and that depth. And so yeah, I really am excited about these poems, and I would very much like to read more of my poems on my channel from this trilogy to give you a taste of what it's like. I've already shared other poems on my channel from 1 and 2, and I definitely encourage you to check those out. And I want to be able to do more poems on my channel to be able to share. So yeah, I'm Phoenix, and I will admit that this trilogy of poetry is definitely out of the box thinking because of the subject matter which I've described, whether dealing with sexuality or mental illness or human experience and my own experience as a person. It's very difficult because of all of the emotions involved, as well as the form itself in which I use, which is much more, I would describe, a little bit unorthodox. But I would say that the unorthodox elements of even writing poetry, when people don't even read poetry anymore, is part of my aesthetic as an author. I realize that there are ways in which I haven't really fit in any kind of establishment or routine or regime or regimen. And so what this means is I am often branching out on my own. Writing has allowed me to do a lot of wonderful things, but part of what it includes is putting yourself out there in ways that are not immediately intelligible and predictable. And that can be really hard to do. And I find this book to be inspiring in that way because it really seeks to develop its own path. It really wants to be its own thing. And so that is why I emphasize language and poetry and experience and strong emotions and even pain and suffering to be able to capture what I hope is a very interesting aesthetic to people who read, and hopefully people who enjoy poetry and like what poetry can do. I've talked about my radical poetry in the past, and one of the things that I would say is very important is that I very much hope to capture the intensity of my experience in my poems. And I do want to capture my experience as what I would describe as quote-unquote being an outsider, and going out on a limb and believing in something and doing it anyway. You can tell that I am willing to do that with my books like a pack of cards, as you can tell. And it definitely is very remarkable that I've been able to do this. Remarkable in the sense of I'm glad that I've had the opportunity and that I'm able to express myself and to share my work. It really isn't something that I've always expected myself to be able to do. So I'm very glad. As a writer, I've dealt with a lot of rejections, but I do feel determined to move forward, to continue to create an aesthetic that is uniquely my own, and that I hope that expresses the things that are important to me, and I hope to contribute to the world in that way. I hope that I can make the world better through my writing, and bring a little bit of light and joy, and also context and understanding to this complicated world that we live in. So yeah, I definitely encourage you to check it out. I'm Phoenix, thank you for watching, and I will see you next time.